Right. This is your host, Recluse, aka Steven Snyder, for this week. As always, Frank Zero is on the astral plane, doing battle with the forces of darkness and prepping for next week's show. This week, we've got a returning guest who will hopefully be able to speak more this time around. I'm, of course, referring to the great Paul Weston. Paul is the author of Mysterium Artorius, Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus, Babylonian Eon, the Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries, UFOlogy, Glastonbury's Psychogeography, the Michael Line, the Kabbalah, and the Terra, Etergidius, William Blake, and the Glastonbury Gnosis, the Occult Battle of Britain. He has also published and contributed to the anthology Signs and Secrets of the Glastonbury Zodiac. Having majored in comparative religion for a combined arts degree, Paul went on to work for the Scientology-influenced Institute of Hypnosis and Parapsychology. He eventually became completely absorbed in the Glastonbury Matrix and was fortunate to be closely involved in the psychic questing work of Andrew Collins, a Glastonbury tour guide and frequent lecturer whose presentations are increasingly uploaded onto YouTube. His other main influences and inspirations include Colin Wilson, Dion Fortune, Rika, Mother Mira, The Fellowship of Isis, John Cooper Palace, Osho, Psychogeography, Gurdjieff, Anthony Robbins, and UFOlogy. Paul, thanks so much for joining us again.
My pleasure.
All right, so today we are going to be exploring some of the ideals and concepts you present in Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus. This is a great book and very much a 21st century version of the Cosmic Trigger. It is jam-packed with all kinds of incredible informations, connections, and analysis. This made it a little bit difficult to narrow down the topics for this week, but I think I've managed. So to start with, can you give us a bit of an idea of what spurred you to write this book in the first place and the general overview of the themes that it explores?
Okay, well, I was engaged in an enormous writing project, my book Babylonian Eon. It took me 10.5 years to get this thing together, and it was autobiographical and it featured a lot of Glastonbury experiences, but it was also encyclopedic and tried to give an overall perspective on the bigger picture, the context of what my life at that time fitted into. And so there was a lot of stuff about Crowley, who was a theme that I was very, very interested in. And I'd written also a lot of stuff about Arthurian themes, and I found that some of the writing just took on a life of its own. And in the end, there was so much of it that there was simply too much. So I hived off over 100 pages of material that became Mysterium Artorius, added to it a little bit. Some of that still remained in Babylonian Eon, but then I enjoyed that so much, I thought, why don't I do another one that's just some of my lectures that I gave in Glastonbury. I've done one on Crowley. I've incorporated quite a bit of the material into Babylonian Eon. And as I started to do this, I realised I'd also got some stuff on the psychedelic era, on Jack Parsons' Babalon work, and I started to think, well, what if I kind of started to put this stuff together as a book all on its own? And that was the root of it, and it took on a life of its own. In the period of time I was writing it, for example, I actually ended up around the time of my 50th birthday in April 2009 in Cairo, in front of the artifact known as the Stela of Revealing, that's so central to Crowley's magical career. On the actual dates of the 3 days of the Feast of the Book of the Law, that we'll say a little bit about in a moment, reciting some of it out loud during the time of day that it was received, which was an outcome that I wasn't even remotely in my head when I started. So I felt the thing was kind of had a certain impetus behind it. And during 2007, a few years prior to that, whenever there's a 7 in the year, there's always a lot of talk of Roswell and the UFO era and the anniversaries. There was a lot of material in the air. And I just found myself being taken over by it and more or less giving over half the year to ufology. And that just all wove its way in there. And I got the thing out right at the end of the decade. And I launched it on the 6th of December 2009, which was, and this is possibly foolishly, the exact 100th anniversary of the legendary ceremony to invoke Choronzon in the Algerian desert that Crowley and Victor Neuburg engaged in. So that was all. It was all quite a ride. It was quite a ride, and I paid a lot of attention to what I was doing. Down to, it took me 3 months to figure out what I wanted as the image of the cover. But I'm very fortunate that there's a great artist called Leary, and when I give my designs to him, and they're very specific. They're to the millimetre, basically. He will execute it, and he will do it in a way that I'm entirely happy with. So everything about it, there was a strong dynamism behind it, and now over 10 years later, I'm entirely happy with it. I'm sure there's a few little bits and pieces where I've got some facts wrong, and there's a few things I might like to change, but the broad sweep of it, and this is kind of confirmed for me by the fact that you've recently read it and found it sufficiently interesting to want to dedicate a whole show to talking about it with me. I feel it's got some voltage and some mileage.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I personally think that the book is even more relevant now than when you initially wrote it. Is this the sense that you have as well?
Well, yeah, I don't think that it's just kind of an interesting intellectual examination of some peculiar ideas. I think that it is plugged into some kind of zeitgeist, which to me is broadly what Crowley calls the Aeon of Horus, and something that is, it's alive. It's not just an idea. And the measure of it is the fact that the distinct things that in the course of the book I identify as characteristic of the Aeon of Horus, they're still very much with us and mutating and taking on even more unusual forms, but still with that distinct identifying characteristics.
Now, definitely, to me, the most interesting aspect of the book was your notion of the collective crossing of the abyss of society undergoing. But we got to lay a little groundwork before we get to that. So, can you first explain to the listeners the origins of the concept of the abyss and the crossing of it?
Right. Okay. So first of all, we've got to go back to Crowley. I'll say briefly, because it's a pretty well-known story, that in Egypt in 1904, him and his wife Rose are led to a strange episode in a hotel room lasting 3 days in April 8th to the 10th, where supposedly a discarnate intelligence called IWAS audibly dictates to them 3 chapters of a book, which tells how the old world has gone up in flames on the inner plane, and a new epoch characterized by ferocious warfare and the breaking down of old forms on one level, and overseen by energies that could be symbolized by the Egyptian god of war Horus, is now upon us. Now, Crowley was a graduate of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He'd already been through a significant amount of their teaching material, and that is based on the Kabbalistic tree of life, the most well-known image of which is basically 10 spheres joined together by different pathways, 22 paths. And the Golden Dawn system of magic involves you working your way from the bottom upwards through a sequence of elemental grades. You take on all kinds of knowledge and ideas. And when you get to the middle, the idea started to come about through the work of the Golden Dawn chief, Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers. He had translated a famous grimoire, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, which was a procedure on how to make contact with your holy guardian angel. And this was something that involved, 6 months retreat, invoking angels' prayers, and then invoking demons and getting them to swear allegiance to you. And it was like a contact with some higher part of yourself, but also perhaps some intelligence that is beyond you. There's a paradox there that they can perhaps be the same thing. Crowley would say this apparently paradoxical thing to 2 different people. Yeah, it's your higher self. No, it's an actual external entity. But anyway, in the middle of the tree of life, in the sun sphere that is called Tifereth, you make some kind of contact with a higher aspect of yourself. But having done that, you then have to kind of let it go. And as you work your way further up, there's a series of experiences of that old chestnut ego dissolution, a thing that many people claim to have done, but it tends to usually be the case that, in fact, the exact opposite has occurred. But there's a controversial sphere of the tree of life beyond the normal 10, one called Darth, which has a different kind of status in different systems. In some, it's not necessarily considered to be a full-on zone unto itself, but it lies in a zone that you kind of have to cross over. And on the other side is the supernal realms, or where you reconnect with your guardian angel. Now, the way Crowley experienced this is another great magical drama when, having worked his way through to his own satisfaction, a lot of these grazing systems, having got this blueprint that he's the prophet of a new epoch, he and the poet and his magical associate and lover, Victor Neuburg, they crossed the Algerian desert in the latter part of 1909. They're working their way through John D. and Edward Kelly's system of Enochian magic. And it's all about Crowley crossing the abyss ultimately. And in order to do this, he has to confront this dweller on the threshold, who John D. had first written a little bit about, calling him Choronzon. And Crowley is the person that has made this, whatever it is, most well known. It's a kind of, on one hand, a very, very potent, well, maybe a sort of Jungian shadow, but a very potent force in which you can potentially become completely embroiled, and all the negative sides of your character will overwhelm and destroy you. And perhaps it is a doorway into other realms. Crowley doesn't develop this in quite the way that some other people do, but there is a sense in the Golden Dawn that there is an antimatter tree of life. This is something that's there in Jewish law, in the Kabbalistic law, the realms of the so-called Qliphoth, the empty shells. And normally this is placed underneath the tree of life. We'll come to another version of this when we get to Kenneth Grant. But all of this is part of what Crowley feels you have to kind of go through. Many people feel that he messed this up completely and ruined himself forever and never really came out of this, the other side, in a sane manner. Other people believe that he sorted it. But to him, this is where he first encounters the goddess form Babalon, who exists in the Kabbalistic sphere of Binah, above the abyss. And this is a kind of knowledge and understanding, a very fierce form of the divine feminine that maybe we could understand as a little bit like the Hindu goddess Kali. You've got to give up every last drop of the blood of your ego into her chalice. And again, this is the kind of game that many people have romanticized and dramatized and tried to make out they've actually achieved, but whether they really have or not is definitely open to question. Crowley leaves that kind of blueprint, but it's Jack Parsons who then really takes the ball and runs with it. He's taken on board exactly the same basic foundational model of reality, the Golden Dawn Crowley schemata of the Kabbalistic tree of life, crossing the abyss. It's a known thing, increasingly famous, that he had conceived of this Babalon working with L. Ron Hubbard, and Marjorie Cameron turns up. They are working with John Dee's magic. They're in the same zone. They're doing the same kind of thing. And after this, that played out, the famous occasion, that Hubbard's run off with the money and it all seems to have gone wrong, Parsons makes a further kind of effort where he pledges himself to basically believe that everything that happens to him is a direct communication from God or his higher self, and that he will cross the abyss to the other side. Now, of course, he is, a spectacular comet, because whatever he crosses on the other side is exploded. And he dies, and the sense of having come to a point where you can potentially come to extreme grief. There is a level of the game that is known as crossing the abyss in that tradition, which seems to very much, when it comes to spectacular figures like Crowley and Parsons, they very much believed in this, and some of the most powerful experiences of their life came through it. Now, there are some people who will just say, there is no abyss and nobody has ever crossed it. I am very much a guy who's filled his head up with the example set by Robert Anton Wilson. I know the map is not the territory, but this is a very useful model, and its fruitfulness I assess by, how much mileage can you fruitfully get from it? How much understanding of other things are you helped with by being willing to believe that maybe, in some way this is the case?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, it's just really fascinating when you sort of see, I guess, the progression of events, which you talked about in the book from John Dee, kind of discovering the name of Choronzon with a slightly different spelling towards the end of the 16th century, and then just how the thing kind of gradually sort of goes dormant for several hundred years until the Golden Dawn revives it. And yes, I mean, there's, I guess, almost a sense of a time error or timing or something like this for all this to be unleashed or something to that effect. But it's quite an interesting topic. But on the note of other interesting topics, one of my favorite parts of Aeon was your discussion surrounding Boleskine, Crowley's infamous lodge in Scotland. As regular listeners of this podcast and readers of my blog are well aware, I'm quite interested in this location because of its association with Clan Fraser of Lovat. Not only did they build and own Boleskine, but also a lot of the other rounds surrounding it, which is in the Loch Ness area. So, the Clan Fraser of Lovat, they're a pretty strange lot in their own right, but there was also a lot of strangeness in general going on in this whole area. Can you give us some examples of the reports prior to Crowley purchasing Boleskine?
I certainly can go into some detail there. I began to mention this on our previous conversation, but we were pressed for time, and Alan was on the show as well, so I can go into a lot more detail about that now. The first thing that I'll say is the context, and this is something that I think is definitely interesting in terms of the Hellier scene, is that there is a fault line, the Great Glen fault line, that extends along underneath Loch Ness. Now, this is something that is possibly an underlying factor in a whole bunch of high strangeness that seems to cluster around the area. Now, as a result of being friends with Andrew Collins, I became aware of an episode back in 1979 where he and Graham Phillips and Martin Keaton went to Loch Ness. And what they did there was basically what nobody else seemed to have done before, which was to simply hang about for a few days, go in the local libraries, go through the archives, and they found that the place was an absolute hotbed of the full spectrum. We're talking UFO sightings, big cats, hairy monsters, little people, the works. And perhaps, my favourite, I guess, is what I'd call a time slip folk tale. There was a couple who disappeared during the mid-18th century at one end of the loch. And a century later, during some freak thunderstorm, two disorientated people dressed in strangely old-fashioned clothes turn up, trying to get some help from a priest in an almshouse. And they hang about for a couple of days in a weird, confused state. They're not sure what the hell's going on. And they leave and are never seen again. Now, even though, in terms of how do we research the authenticity of this, to what extent is it just a folk tale? The fact that such a story is even told of a locale is extremely interesting. So that is kind of there in the background. Now, Crowley, in 1899, he's gone for a certain amount of Golden Dawn teachings. He's met Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, and he's become aware of this sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage. And it's a very romantic idea to set yourself apart for 6 whole months in a specially prepared environment. The text of this work is very specific about certain details of the kind of place that you want. And he went around the country looking for somewhere that was going to fit the bill. And this is where he finds Boleskine. And this is where, indeed, he starts the great Abramelin procedure. And, it's something that you've got to start at Easter, and it's supposed to take 6 whole months, and you just gradually build up a head of steam. You start off by doing all these prayers and hymns and invoking angels. And when stuff starts to happen, when you're about halfway through, that's when you start invoking demons, and they've got to kind of agree that you are their master. This is obviously where things get very problematical. And there's all kinds of accounts, and bear in mind, these are from Crowley himself, of weird stuff that starts to happen in the environment. He's in the main room where he's doing his magic in broad sunshine and daylight, and yet it seems to be really dark in there. He's got to pull these lights on. There's a whole area of sand outside, and there are strange shadowy forms manifesting in it. People who come to visit him go into weird spaces, go insane, attack him, run away, etc., etc., and that the locals start to get, really concerned about what's going on. Now, it's during this period of time that he first, there's a whole problem with the Golden Dawn at that time, and there's a rebellion against Samuel MacGregor Mathers, and Crowley rushes off to help him in Paris, which means that he breaks off the Abramelin operation and doesn't really, as far as we know, close the thing down. He just walks away from it. Now, he later returns to it and does it all in his head when he's on a journey across China in 1905. But the main thing is that he has left something in the airways of Boleskine and he's walked away from it. Now, not long after that, he meets Rose Kelly and has this impetuous romance with her and ends up marrying her. And the early part of their marriage is actually spent at Boleskine before they go off on their subsequent Egyptian adventure that leads to, big deal in a hotel room and the transmission of the Book of the Law. The whole thing kind of starts with this Abramelin, and it's inseparable, in my opinion, from the whole story that plays out. And in this weird Book of the Law, there is, in the 3rd chapter, a passage that says, "Get the Stela of Revealing." Now, the Stela of Revealing is an Egyptian funerary kind of wooden signifier that was found in a museum at Cairo by Rose in strange circumstances, and is kind of like a thelemic icon. Get the Stela of Revealing itself, set it in thy secret temple, and that temple is already a right disposed, and it shall be your Qibla forever. Now, the temple that's already a right disposed was his existing home at Boleskine. And the Qibla is a Islamic term, and it refers to the direction that prayers should be addressed. Obviously with Islam, it's a meteoric black stone of the angel Gabriel at Mecca, where they face every single day. In this case, it's suggested that Crowley's got to get a replica of the Stela, and he's got to install it at Boleskine. And from that point on, in the various rituals that he writes and the instructions that he gives, the idea is that thelemic magicians are to orientate themselves to begin their procedures by facing the direction of Boleskine. It is the magical east for thelemites. Now, these days, not all thelemites take that absolutely seriously, but there's no doubt that basically for over 100 years now, people have been focusing their intent, as it were, in the direction of Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, which is, a very kind of particular form of concentration. The whole idea of Crowley's magic and the New Aeon, it's all kind of being focused up there. There are probably people somewhere around the entire world, pretty much every day, giving a little bit of attention perhaps in that direction, and that's been the case for a long time. So that's quite a thing in itself. And my kind of perspective on this is that it may well be, in the bigger scheme of things, for which Crowley was acting as a not entirely conscious agent at that point, the Abramelin demons needed to be unleashed around a location that would come to be the focus of so much attention. Because obviously he had no idea when he first did this Abramelin of what was coming, and that the adventure in Cairo would begin, and so forth. So what we've got is a kind of folktale belief that's gradually developed, whereby Crowley's demon invocations in the immediate vicinity of the Loch were a factor in the modern appearances of the monster. And what I find interesting is, if you look at the Abramelin ritual, when you get into the point that you've got to get the demons on the go, the first group of demons that you've got to invoke are known as the 4 superior princes of hell. And that's Satan, Lucifer, Belial, and Leviathan. Leviathan is a sea monster of Old Testament vintage, generally taken to be some kind of coiled serpent with blazing eyes. And some people have considered that the Babylonian goddess Tiamat, who came to be personified as a water serpent embodiment of primal chaos, is connected there. And in her most famous version of the Tiamat myth, her body is dismembered and used to make the world. And some of Tiamat may be there, in Leviathan. So that is all kind of there. You've got the range of high strangeness. You've got the time slip. I came to believe, from what Andy had discovered, that the whole Loch Ness area is what they used to call in ufology a few decades back, a window area. It's kind of an open portal for a whole range of strangeness. And the association of Crowley with the Loch, it kind of, it generated a bit of folklore. And there was a very instructional episode in 1973. There was a Reverend Donald Omand. He was kind of TV exorcist. He was quite a well-known figure in the UK at the time. And he and a guy who had written a book about the Loch Ness Monster, guy called Ted Holliday, they basically went and engaged in a massive exorcism ceremony of the whole of Loch Ness. Now, Holliday had started off thinking that the Loch Ness Monster was like just a dinosaur relic or something like that, but he started to realise that stuff a bit strange was going on. He'd already written a book called The Dragon and the Disc, and that is basically linking accounts of lake monsters and dragons with ancient Stone Age sites, UFO activity, what was then believed to be flesh and blood aliens, and so on. He thought that all of this was a unity, and he also felt that the Loch had got a bad vibe and that Crowley hadn't helped much. Now, this exorcism, they go out on they go 60 miles around the entire Loch, and they're stopping off at 4 points to do this ceremony, and they go out in a boat and do this further banishment. And afterwards, the BBC got them to reenact this scene in the boat. So it's on British TV at the time. Now, the thing for Holliday that was real weird was that after this was over, he had made an arrangement. He was going to spend a night with some friends of his who lived by the Loch. And they themselves had heard about a UFO close encounter from John Keel, that there was a Swedish student who'd been wandering in woods near the Loch, claimed to have seen a landed craft in the clearing, and 3 weird dudes wearing grey suits and headgear like divers' helmets were visible by it. And barely had this young lad registered his feeling they weren't human, then a hatch opens in the craft. They go in, it lifts off and flies away. Now, this case now is generally considered to be bogus, but the important thing is they were thinking about it, they were talking about it, and for Holliday, something really strange starts to happen. The exorcist guy had already told Holliday, don't go to where this close encounter is supposed to have happened. And his host said, just don't do it. Do not do it. You're going to get abducted. And he kind of thinks, all right, I won't do it. He says to him, okay, I'm not going to go. Now, the minute this happens, there's this huge rushing sound outside the window. There's a moving mass of weird, dark smoke. There's big thuds shaking the door. It lasts, 15, 20 seconds. Of the 2 people that he's with, one of them has exactly the same experience and sees a beam of white light coming through the window and hitting Holliday's forehead at the exact point where he'd had holy water put on him during the exorcism. The other guy in the place has no sense of anything weird going on at all. And when Holliday leaves the next morning, he sees an odd-looking man wearing goggles and black leather, seemingly waiting for him. And he thinks, well, who the hell is this? Is this an apparition? Is this a real person? So he walks over to meet it, and for just a moment, he glances away to the floor. And the moment he's looked back, this figure is gone. Now, a year later, Holliday's back again staying with these people. He has a heart attack at the exact location as he's walking across where this apparition had been standing. He has a heart attack. He's carried on a stretcher. He realises it's the same place where this strange man had been standing. And indeed, in the end, it was a heart condition that would kill him. So you've got, a tenuous, non-rational set of connections, a mood of high strangeness, all of which is kind of suggesting that the magical focal point of Crowley's New Aeon is a multi-dimensional window area for a wide spectrum of paranormal weirdness. Most notably, the Loch Ness monster. And it seems that similar areas have been energized and activated worldwide, so that the critters have gained greater access to our world and our psyches. And this is where, you know, Lovecraft, Kenneth Grant, and so on kind of come in, because the idea of a monster being awoken from a primal sleep in the watery depths and returning to terrify the rational world was gestated in other places as well as Loch Ness during the early decades of the 20th century. And in Call of Cthulhu, you know, Lovecraft details how the demented devotees of Cthulhu claim that when the old gods regain control of the planet, mankind will become free and wild beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. And that sounds pretty damn Crowley-ish, you know, to me. So it's back to this idea that below the Kabbalistic tree of life, there's what you might call an antimatter version, a shadow realm where the spheres and paths are populated by weird entities called the Qliphoth. They're kind of demonic. They're dealt with to some extent in the Golden Dawn. Crowley certainly wrote of them, and he made weird drawings and seals of different kind of sigils that you could use to open up these zones. But Kenneth Grant is the guy that really takes it all the way, because what he does is he raises it up so that it's no longer kind of underneath the tree of life as if a reflection in a kind of pool at the foot of it. It's directly behind it, and the point of entry between the two is this realm of Darth. He calls it the tunnels of Set. What you've got behind there, it's his third book, Night Side of Eden, where he really goes to town on it. So this Darth is basically the veil of the abyss. So where Crowley encounters Choronzon, this dweller on the threshold, what you've got on the other side of that is ingress to a realm or a place from which can emerge into our realm a whole enormous, great, you know, load of high strangeness and critters. Now, I hadn't seen this detail when I wrote the Crowley book, but in Asgartis, I've been able to make use of the amazing findings of Peter Lavender in The Dark Lord, because what he's shown us, which I think is fabulous, because it's so contentious linking Crowley and Lovecraft together. They're so dissimilar in their temperaments and their ideas, and there are many people that really get upset about the idea that you can somehow put their magical systems together. But here's the thing, you see, what Lavender has shown us is that the Call of Cthulhu, which is the foundation, obviously, of so much of what follows. He writes it in 1926, but the important action is set over Halloween in 1907. And in that section, the New Orleans police bust this orgiastic ritual in honor of Cthulhu, and they find a statue of him, which is described by Lovecraft. Now, we've got the Book of the Law in 1904, and it's considered to be something in a class of its own in terms of the level of inspiration. But there's another bunch of inspired texts that are considered to be class A, as they're categorized, in which Crowley believes that they were not written, you know, just by him, but they were by a higher level of inspiration, that were written in 1907. And he says he can't doubt these books are the works of an intelligence independent of his own. And in one of these, he writes about some weird, pure black marble, sorry statue, the changeless pain of the eyes of the figure depicted, and that it's undoubtedly a strange deity. And there's a series of weird words that he just kind of adds to that. And one of them is Cthulhu, as it is written in the ancient book. That's the exact quote. Now, Cthulhu, it's pretty near. He's used that word, and he never actually understands or explains what it means. It's just popped into his head. And in another one of these holy books from the same period of time, there's a whole bunch of imagery that is about, you know, some kind of beast in the depths, a terrible serpent that's the end of all things. I trembled at thy coming, O my God, for thy messenger was more terrible than the Death Star. On the threshold stood the fulminant figure of evil, the horror of emptiness, with his ghastly eyes like poisonous wells. He stood and the chamber was corrupt, the air stank. He was an old and gnarled fish, more hideous than the shells of Abaddon. He enveloped me with his demon tentacles. Now, what's kind of really strange about all of this is that Crowley does give you the dates that these were composed, and it's between October the 30th and November the 1st, 1907. So remember that Lovecraft has actually set his Cthulhu story, the roots of it, on October the 31st, right in the middle of that in 1907. Now, what Kenneth Grant would say is that basically, although these guys are very different, they're tuned into the same radio station and they're expressing it through their own distinct individual temperaments. But one way or another, part of the flavour of the newly emerging epoch, where a whole previous reality has gone up in flames, is that we now have this ingress from other realms of high strangeness. And part of that is in the realms of the increasing emergence of ufology, which certainly happens around about the time Jack Parsons gets going. And it's also with this awareness of these non-human intelligences, which may be really terrifying, or maybe, it's very, very difficult to work out what's going on here. And this is why when I've dealt with this stuff in the book, I've gone back to our old mate Robert Anton Wilson and his concept of Chapel Perilous. Ted Holliday wrote a book in the end called The Goblin Universe about all of his investigation of ufological high strangeness. So I've called the section in my book Chapel Perilous Adventures in the Goblin Universe. And this is this kind of area that you enter into where you can become, either a total agnostic or a total paranoid, because as Robert Anton Wilson says, everything you fear is waiting with slavering jaws in Chapel Perilous. If you go in there without your faculties balanced, then you may lose your mind, you may lose your emotions, you may approach it without the wand of intuition, stand at a door for decades, never realising you've arrived. But everything that you fear is waiting for you in there, and this is something that I think, this test of discrimination, this test of intelligence is one of the things that we need to be best armed with as we go into this modern epoch, because ufological high strangeness is something that really does do people's heads in and leads you, potentially open to a whole load of paranoia and an endless hall of mirrors in which you can just completely lose the plot. But this basic idea that you are being put through an initiatory ordeal with this, that the whole thing, the whole eruption of the ufological epoch, and what we get in the books of the likes of John Keel is a collective intelligence test in which our old ways of orientating ourselves, our understanding of who we are and what we are in this universe and what reality consists of is being undermined, and we can potentially be destroyed, because the Aeon of Horus is a time characterized by ferocious warfare. We've had Auschwitz and Hiroshima. We've still got an awful lot of things going on in this world that do not sit very well at all. But on the other hand, we've had, the best, for example, of the consciousness revolution in the 60s. We've had, right in the middle of the Book of the Law, there are 3 chapters, the chapter in the middle, the second chapter. The terminology, in many respects for me, calls to mind the core process of the 20th century, where we kind of exploded reality. On the one hand, we split the atom, we discovered DNA, out of that came the atom bomb, came LSD, and our own consciousness is completely cannot be separated from that in the way that the subject object cause and effect of previous science did. We're completely immersed in an enormous great process, and all of this eruption of high strangeness is part of that. So with that kind of meta perspective, if you like, I've been able to kind of look at more modern episodes with, I feel a useful perspective that gives me an understanding that helps me, I hope, to not get completely lost in them.
Yes, I mean that's quite fascinating. So yes, one of the things that was kind of interesting to me is like when exactly do you think that this kind of collective crossing had happened? Did it begin with the 1909 ritual, with the dictation of the Book of the Law, with the exploding of the atom bomb, which has been a popular trope recently with the return of Twin Peaks and so forth, with Parsons, Babalon working, or do you think this was all sort of like an ongoing process to get to this, kind of collective crossing of the abyss?
I'm certainly willing to believe that something mighty strange began round about 1904. Now, in my book, I think I'm the only person so far who's linked this in, what was happening to Crowley with what was happening to Gurdjieff, because Gurdjieff talked a lot in his Beelzebub's Tales about something that had happened in Tibet, which sounded very similar to what Crowley was saying about the Aeon of Horus, that basically there had been a point where the balance in the energies of the world had changed and a new epoch of ferocious warfare was ushered in. And he told this story in typical weird Gurdjieffian terminology about this mystical secret society in Tibet that had been hanging about since the time of Padmasambhava. And there are only a few of them, and they were high adepts. And somehow or another, they held the balance of the energies of warfare in the whole world in check. And there was one of their number was about to kind of become almost a living deity, was going to go through some transitional phase, and everything was highly auspicious. But then there was a scenario where a British military force came into Tibet. Some Tibetans met up with them. Something went wrong. A number of Tibetans were massacred, and the leader of this group was one of them. And from that point, and something absolutely massive happened. The remaining members of this group had tried to make some kind of connection with the astral form, the disembodied soul of this being. Something had gone wrong, and there was an enormous great event that was almost like a nuclear explosion that had ruined the whole thing, and it was never able to be put right. Now, what's really intriguing about this is that there is an episode that happened when a British, we'll call it an armed trade delegation. It wasn't an invasion. It's called the Young Husband Expedition. Went into Tibet in 1903, and in March 1904, they did indeed encounter a group of Tibetans that were armed with old-fashioned, muskets and spears and stuff. Somebody misjudges what the others are doing. People are killed. Quite a few hundred Tibetans are killed. Now, the date this happens is March 31st, 1904. Now, Crowley's already in Cairo. The events that have set him in motion for his weird episode started on March the 20th. The 3 days of the Book of the Law are April 8, 9, 10, 1904. So this episode that Gurdjieff's talking about in Tibet is literally right in the middle of that period of time. Now, the big nuke that he talks about, I think, and I mean, this is a few years ahead, but I think he's woven the Tunguska event into that somehow. But whatever the hell he thinks he's doing, the fact that the central event in this is in exactly the same period of time that Crowley's in Egypt is very strange to me, because to the best of my knowledge, nobody else is saying anything. Like, for example, we had a big deal about 2012. In the 19th century, there was a big deal about 1879. There was a whole thing about the earth is governed by angels in set sequence, and an epoch of the Archangel Michael was going to begin in 1879. People like Steiner made a lot about this. It was already known about in advance. People were waiting for it. There was a whole anticipation that a big new epoch in world history was kicking in. But this business in 1904, I don't really have any sense of people anticipating this. And yet, the two biggest magus figures of the 20th century, the most controversial, the most potent figures, Aleister Crowley and George Gurdjieff, are both right there, saying something that's very, very similar when you boil it down. So I think it starts then. it is set in motion, and it is characterized by a breaking down of our sense of fixed reality. You know, I talk in the book, the whole beginnings of quantum physics and so on, the kind of science whereby we no longer see things as being fixed, you know, that light can be a wave or a particle, you know, that there is indeterminacy, you know, that things are only statistical probabilities now. All of this is starting to come in the first decade of the 20th century, along with the insights of Freud and Jung and so on. And it's interesting, you know, we got so much into Terence McKenna in the run-in to 2012 with his exponential acceleration. Yeah, his work was very much based on the work of Henry James, who was talking about phase changes in exponential acceleration in 1909, and thinking that basically the rate at which scientific innovation was going to increase was going to, you know, hit what we now call a McKenna omega point, probably in the early part of the 21st century. So all of these things that are characteristic of our sense of the 20th century are in motion there. But there's no question that the nukes and so on are a massive thing. And I am willing to believe that Jack Parsons, who you know, was clearly a man of great destiny, and, you know, very, very extraordinary bunch of people gathered there. L. Ron Hubbard, Marjorie Cameron. That is no normal combination of people. I'm prepared to believe that they ripped open a hole in the fabric of reality. Obviously, it's now become part of the mythology, if you like, that, you know, somehow the UFO epoch was in some way ushered in by them. This is a little bit, you know, it's a difficult one to kind of quantify. We do know that Marjorie Cameron saw what we would now call, you know, we'll say it's a UFO because it's unidentified flying object above the place, the famous parsonage, the mansion where the Babalon working was hatched out and performed before the UFO epoch began. We've got all of this, you know, contentious stuff from Kenneth Grant about this Aleister Crowley drawing that's come to be called Lamb, that somehow or another, you know, Crowley himself is all part of this. One way or another, if you take that on board and you work with it, there's no question that you plug yourself into some very, very interesting spaces. You know, I know Michael Staley, who is Kenneth Grant's closest associate in the Typhonian OTO, and the person most responsible for the advocacy of what you could call the cult of Lamb. And, you know, I'm certainly aware of the fact that the download, if you like, for Andrew Collins' book, The Cygnus Mystery, which is one of the most perfect downloads I've ever known anybody to get, came directly out of doing a lamb ritual with Michael Staley. So this thing has got some legs on it. You know, people say, yeah, that's not an ET. People say, oh, that's Crowley's bad drawing of Lao Tzu or something. But if you get into this stuff, it's very, very potent, and you can actually go quite a long way with it. But, you know, keeping your discrimination, your critical faculties about you at all times is useful.
But do you think that that also like the Boleskine and the Loch Ness area would play into this as well? And I asked, you know, this question because, as I'm sure you're probably aware, I'm more of a parapolitical researcher, and that was kind of what really drove me to becoming very obsessed with this particular area, because it was really where I think in a sense you could trace the modern emergence of modern special operations forces. Of course, the Lovat Scouts were founded there at another castle off of Loch Ness. I believe it was a dory or something like that. And they were one of the quote unquote pioneers of unconventional warfare. And a lot of the guys would later help set up the special air services and whatnot. And then the private military industry in the 60s. And what it amounts to is now when you in the States, when you're looking at the Trump administration, this is an administration that was really put into power, I think, by a combination of the Joint Special Operations Command and a lot of these private military companies. And I almost get the sense that there was kind of this new emerging warrior elite that almost, you know, traces their origins back to Loch Ness at the turn of the last century, and now have really started to gain a pervasive influence in both the US and the UK going into the 21st century. Do you also kind of get a sense that there was also kind of this connection as well to Loch Ness? What was all, you know, all this that's going on with the high weirdness that you're describing?
What I think is very, very difficult to establish is the extent to which people are manoeuvred into various positions. When I say positions, I mean geographical locations, and I put through particular things as priming for stuff that is to come, and to what extent they are conscious of it, and to what extent the way they organise themselves has the intent of a long-term operation. Or it's like this business, but in the first place, when Crowley first comes there and starts the Abramelin thing off, he can't have the slightest idea of what is going to come a few years ahead with the Book of the Law in Cairo. The whole idea that there's going to be a magical current set in motion where people from all around the world, for 100 years to come, are all going to be focusing their attention on that exact area. That something like, although there's a bit of folklore in the area, for example, there's a Saint Columba who's had a bit of a tussle with what we might take to be an early version of the Loch Ness monster, but it's nearby. It's not even on the Loch, and a lot of these saints are known to bash a few monsters about. To what extent, could he really anticipate what was coming? Now, and that means to what extent are people manipulated by external intelligences? And you may have some lodges, you may have some Masonic lodges, you may have various groups of people where someone in that group is capable of going into a weird state of consciousness and getting peculiar messages from who knows what or where, and the people around them pay sufficient attention to those messages to actually act on them. And when it's like, okay, you need to establish a group of people in this area and prepare yourself for some great work that's coming a little bit further on, maybe that kind of thing is going down. And we get a sense of this. This is one of the reasons why I spent so much time talking about Montauk, that the idea of how far back does this go, and what is the level of cohesion of conscious intent amongst actual people, that are tangibly communicating with each other and carrying out agendas. It's like the way information comes out. You can look into these subjects, you can spend years and years and years on it, and then all of a sudden some bit of information comes out that takes you to another level of the game with it, and you think, well, why was that information, which seems to be in plain sight, hidden? Why, when I've been paying so much attention to this, did I not realise this years and years ago? It's like there is a very, very strange time release mechanism, that like the sense of a bigger picture of what has always been the case is you're being tantalised by it. And that's, I think, when you get into the realms of what you might call conspiratorial research, that is part of the Chapel Perilous side of it. That, there is that sense of an infinite mind game, as you just realised. It becomes ever, it's just a Mandelbrot fractal. There's no flipping end to it. You in the end, it's almost like you have an idea and some bit of research will suddenly make you realise that was true back in the 18th century or something like that. And it's almost as if, well, did I somehow make that up as reality just bent to accommodate that, and I'm actually helping to make this more real? This is where it gets, interesting and difficult.
Well, that brings up a nice segue into another topic I wanted to get into it with you. Another one of my favorite parts of Aeon was your exploration of the Montauk mythos. Of course, this is a really controversial subject, and I think you provide a very, very thoughtful account of it. Could you briefly give us like an overview of Montauk and explain to the uninitiated some of the crucial points?
Right. Well, okay. Well, I found myself really liking the early Montauk books. Even though part of my critical intelligence could kind of say, yikes, there was just something about it that I kept on reading. So by the time I got to writing my Crowley book, I'd been going back over the Montauk books as they stood at that point for over 10 years. So I'd read some of them 3 or 4 times. So I was in a position, to kind of, I felt, give a good account of how things were then from my point of view. So, okay, so I've gone through for the books that I had covered by then. There's the basic original, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon's The Montauk Project, and then there's Montauk Revisited, which was Adventures in Synchronicity, Pyramids of Montauk. Then there's also Preston Nichols' solo Encounters in the Pleiades, and Peter Moon's solo The Black Sun, which was the so-called Montauk Nazi Tibet connection. But I really like the ones that I really got into were Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, and the Montauk Book of the Dead. So I mean, in the whole lot, you've got Crowley, the Babalon working, Scientology, Pyramids of Egypt and Mars, historical and legendary ancient civilizations, sacred geometry, a planetary grid of sacred sites, mind control, ETs, the Illuminati, the New World Order, Nazi occultism, with its modern spin of Antarctic and Tibetan and UFO offshoots, time travel, the Kabbalah, John Dee, Edward Kelly, and above all, synchronicity. This was the thing that I found very, very interesting, even though some of the things being linked together were, from my way of thinking, very tenuous. What I liked was the way that Peter Moon was kind of led into all this. Now, by the time we get into the later books, we found out a lot more about him. The early books have been focused on Preston Nichols, but Peter Moon had been deeply into Scientology. He had been part of the Sea Org. He had been, in the close proximity of L. Ron Hubbard, and he'd gone through an extraordinary tragedy when he was, I think, 21. Both his parents had been killed in a car crash when he was on board one of the Scientology boats. So he was set up with a pretty damned unusual, preparation and mindset right from the word go. And people have said, this is like every single episode of the X-Files all rolled into one and then some. And I know that Peter Moon has often been, out very, very, clear in his intent to say, look, this first book, the basic story of the Montauk Project, came out before any episode of the X-Files had ever screened. So if anything, it's kind of like the other way around. So you've got this basic idea that there is a black ops, infinitely funded government project that is attempting to, mess with space-time using an enormous, great naval radio transmitter, and that in the core of this complex, they're using psychics. There's somebody strapped into a chair. Different multiple dimensions are being accessed, and in the end, the whole thing is kind of crashed in August 1983 when some, Forbidden Planet type monster from the id is unleashed. And this is some kind of almost Bigfoot thing that there's a few dubious photographs of it. And that the area itself around that base was subject to all manner of bizarre shit that was going on. Human behaviour, really strange amongst the young people in the local towns, animals strangely flocking, freak weather, you name it. So it kind of starts off that way. But what I found, one of the things that I really liked about it was that having started from that, and it's expansive enough because it brings in the Philadelphia Project and the idea that some kind of wormhole has been created that linked up the Philadelphia Project in 1943 with the full extent of this Montauk malarkey in 1983. That's enough to be going on with, but gradually it just expands and expands and expands, so that this one particular place is actually, very significantly located. It's somewhere that the Native American legends of the place and what it's all about, that it's some kind of place where the world was created from, all of that comes in. Ultimately, it's linked up to global grids, sacred sites, and that the people who are, the black ops, the techno black magicians, are actually working some kind of enormous great magic on a global basis in a nefarious way. In the original project, they've linked up to the future. They've sent people down something that's like the old TV science fiction show Time Tunnel. They've sent people into the future. They've found a whole bunch of derelicts on the street and sent them thousands of years into the future with video cameras strapped to them, just for shits and giggles, really, by the sounds of it. That there's been a whole bunch of young boys kidnapped, sexually abused and exploited and mind controlled. You name it, absolutely everything is in there somewhere. And in the end, you've got Nazi occultism. It is interesting actually that Peter Moon does uncover a whole history of pro-German Nazi activity in the 1930s in the immediate vicinity on Long Island. Yeah, that's for real. And all manner of strange people come into his orbit, and because of the process of synchronicity, he's kind of got no option other than to just follow the leads that they give. Now, sometimes I think he's being messed with, and sometimes I think he's being led on something interesting. Some of the combinations of things I find incredibly tenuous. As somebody that knows a fair bit about Nazi occultism and so on, I find the Black Sun volume to not be particularly credible. But the basic sense is that you're being led into some kind of way in which there is a path of initiation present in all of this conspiracism. And conspiracism is now, in the last 40 years, well, certainly since the Kennedy assassination, say, it's become such an enormous part of our diet of information and the way that information is given to us. How do we navigate it? And right at the beginning of the Montauk project, Peter Moon says this book is an exercise in consciousness. It's an invitation to view time in a new manner and expand your awareness of the universe. And a lot further down the line in Synchronicity in the Seventh Seal, he says it's absolutely crucial to realise that the Montauk project itself, as originally recounted, is a blend of incredible legend and archetypal mythology mixed with certain irrefutable facts. And in Montauk Revisited, he says perhaps the most important point in dealing with the phenomenon of Montauk is that we are dealing with the stuff of which dreams are made. We are directly tapping into the creative zone of consciousness. And this is there seem to be certain subjects, and the whole range of John Keel, particularly the Mothman, Point Pleasant, certain things, Bigfoot, whatever. When you kind of investigate these things, you've switched something on. Now, if you go into the realm of secret projects, black ops, government operations, then what you find is you are maybe going into a zone that you are never going to satisfactorily get to the bottom of it, and you run the risk, of becoming incredibly paranoid and so forth. But I think what you've got there, it's like the climate of today's conspiracism and the way people respond to these sort of things, and how absolutely everything, sooner or later, if you investigate some weird science project, there will come a point where before long occultism comes in. Before long, you're going to get Crowley mentioned, and normally in a way that's pretty disappointing, because the people that are bringing all this stuff up have got pretty much no knowledge at all of any of it, and it's very kind of sensationalized and just full of paranoia of dark forces and so forth. But with all of the material that I've covered, I've tried to sort of get the sense that somehow there is a road through this, and Robert Anton Wilson's laid out some of the nature of the game with Chapel Perilous, and people like Crowley and Parsons, the sense of the dissolution and the sense that you are going to encounter all the shadow forces and all that's wrong, and all that's going to undermine and destroy you. And this is what seems to be the case for Western civilization, at least. That's characteristic of the Aeon of Horus, that the whole project of Western civilization massively stalled with the two world wars, massively stalled with the Cold War. There was a whole bunch of things that clearly we could have done an awful lot better, but the forces, something or another holds us in place. And they're tangible things sometimes, that they are the actual actions of real dubious, evil, manipulative people and their entrenched kind of organizations and plans, but that ultimately the way to resist it is through the consciousness factor. And if there's nowhere in your own head for them to kind of control you from, then things start to change. And this is, this is the sense that I get ultimately from where Peter Moon gets to with all this Montauk malarkey. Not that every last individual bit of it isn't potentially interesting. I genuinely believe that something catastrophically, cataclysmically weird happened in the 80s. I'm quite willing to believe the timeline got messed about with. I'm quite willing to have a Stranger Things kind of sense of something big having happened then, that multiple timelines and who knows what, and a greater level of ingress from other realms. That once the door had been opened, that once the likes of Parsons and Hubbard had done their thing, that there probably were some people who thought that it was worth tinkering with. And amongst the goat starers and the Russian, psychics and so forth, that something pretty seriously with some high tech quite possibly was done. And that the resonance of the Montauk story is precisely because of that.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up John Keel there too, because Keel actually became really obsessed with Long Island, which he had thought was kind of another window area, like he had been exploring in Point Pleasant in West Virginia, and of course Long Island is where Montauk, a lot of the mythos are set, and it is a very strange area. I know what you're kind of saying about it's tempting to dismiss Montauk as just sort of X-Files on steroids or something like that. But I mean, when you look at Long Island, I mean, you had the whole Melanie Heller, Roy Radin incident, which kind of exposed this network of isolated mansions that were being used for these kinky elite sex parties. You had vicious murders going on, most notably the one at Amityville, which would later inspire the famous horror series. You had reports of rampant cult activity, specifically related to the alleged Son of Sam cult. You had the famed Warlock shop being set up in Brooklyn, which is technically a part of Long Island. And then you had Raymond Buckland setting up shop in Long Island, too, to spread Wicca in the United States. And all this was going on in just the 1970s.
That's a lot. It's a hell of a lot. It's an intensification. It's an acceleration. You get the sense that something is the particle accelerator has really been switched on with it. And a lot of it is pretty damn difficult, strange, unpleasant stuff. There's a body count, there's a lot of insanity. It's like in searching for a potential unifying factor behind the whole lot of it. It's very easy to imagine some completely vacant super psychic strapped into a chair that's been created using ET technology. It's very easy to get carried away.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, kind of on that note too, if you're familiar with the show, a lot of people, especially if they read my blog, are also aware that I'm quite obsessed with Sandy Pearlman, the famed producer / songwriter for Blue Oyster Cult. And, if you've explored BOC's first 3 albums, especially, there's a lot of overlap with the Montauk mythos. I mean, there's a lot of references to Nazism, extraterrestrials, cults, hidden history, remote viewing, and so on and so forth. And the band was based out of Long Island for many years. In fact, there's a lot of references to Long Island in their songs and so forth. Do you get a sense that Pearlman and BOC were also kind of tapping into the same zeitgeist that Moon was later getting into with the Montauk books?
Well, I'm not as far into it as you are, but I certainly do remember the kind of lyrics from Messerschmitt 262 that it's probably not a good idea to sing too loudly in bars these days. Hitler's on the phone from Berlin, says, "I'm going to make you a star," etc., etc. They're great albums. And it just goes with the territory that you have to have. And this is something that you're going to have from about 1965 onwards. You've got to have some excellent band that are plugged into it. It's simply a requirement of a situation like that it has to sort of express itself in popular culture, and that there has to be a killer cool band who will be doing that. And then, they're leaving that trail of breadcrumbs, whatever they knew or whatever they felt. There's an emotional tone that goes with music, and that when you hear it and you've already got your head full of all this information and you're really familiar with the locale, it serves as a doorway into it in its own right. another level of the game. For example, in the Led Zeppelin movie, Song Remains the Same, there's the fantasy sequence in Jimmy Page's Dazed and Confused sequence, which is actually filmed at Boleskine. The bit where there's the hermit figure, and he's climbing up a cliff face, and there's this hermit at the top, and when he looks at his face, it's actually Jimmy Page from a baby to an old man and back again. That's all somehow or another a transmitter of the Boleskine Loch Ness thelemic gnosis. It was to me, it hit me. That was a vehicle for something to connect into my consciousness, and it came through the medium of that 70s rock music, and like you've got your version of that coming through the Blue Oyster Cult. Obviously, Page, living at Boleskine for a little while, certainly very, very into Crowley, is an effective transmitter, and so these guys are effective transmitters. And they've hooked you in. Decades later, it's still alive and kicking, and they've pulled you in.
Out of curiosity, do you think it's kind of strange that it really seems some of these 1970s heavy metal bands were so plugged in? Because obviously, Led Zeppelin, BOC, those were two of the big four, along with Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, and obviously they were heavily ridiculed during that particular era. Though there's been a lot of reevaluation of late, but I mean, it certainly seems like the music was far more sophisticated than it was given credit for in the 70s, and it's definitely, I mean, it was having a certain insight that really nothing else from that era could match in a lot of ways.
Well, I'm one of those people that was fortunate enough to see Zeppelin a few times. I saw them twice in a week when I was still at school, and believe me, there's some film footage of those gigs, and looking back on it, it almost brings tears to my eyes just how astoundingly brilliant it was. And that there is an energy and a mood that is communicated through it. I mean, they're all flipping gods, but Page is the transmitter of it. And it is all about the extent to which, in the golden age of rock, these people are able to express the zeitgeist all the way through, and Blue Oyster Cult, Agents of Fortune, Patti Smith is on the scene, people like her, whether it's rock, whether it's punk, there are people who are virtually shamans in terms of their ability to transmit something, to express something. And even if they couldn't articulate it exactly through the emotion of their music and their words, they've jumped across time to us.
Absolutely. I think maybe in the case of 70s heavy metal, it might be more the golden age of leather. Just got to throw in that little BOC reference for those of you out there. It's all right. Let's wrap things up here with a concluding question for you. So it seems like the themes of the Aeon of Horus are everywhere now. There's more interest in entheogens since, probably any time since the late 60s, early 70s. Lovecraft is huge right now. And of course, you've got the whole Hellier phenomenon, which is introducing a new generation to all of these, curious concepts that you explored in Aeon, along with, earlier works by Robert Anton Wilson and so on and so forth. And it also it seems like the whole process is speeding up as well. I mean, kind of the whole Mandela effect and all this other stuff. Do you think that a lot of these concepts are only going to continue becoming more mainstream going forward, and that the pace is only going to continue to hasten?
Yeah, I think, if you obviously you think of Terence McKenna and exponential acceleration towards 2012. Now, the way 2012 was pitched in the end, there were so many idiots coming up with all kinds of nonsense that the real esoteric side of it, if you like, was kind of neglected. That it was as much about the birth of a new world, and people like John Major Jenkins, who was to me the greatest of all the writers on the subject. He was very clear that although the peak of this transitional cycle was December 2012, there was a window of time, and that went on for quite a few years, and we're just emerging out the other side of it now. And if you look back at the world of 10 years ago, it's a lot of things are very flipping different now, and there is that sense of, and this has come about, the medium is the message, the tech is the transmitter. The way in which the internet has intensified in terms of the way we can access it, the way we're having this conversation now, and it's going to be out on YouTube, and people are going to be listening to it in all sorts of different time scales, in all the inflow and outflow of information and ideas. The way in which the internet encourages synchronicity, it is undoubtedly increasing. You can get access to stuff now in a matter of moments that when I was first getting into all this decades ago, you'd have to go libraries, you'd have to be, ordering books, stuff that you could find in half an hour on Google and completely blow your brain to pieces with. Would take you weeks or even months to sort out 20, 30 years ago. So that's definitely a factor, and we are being led towards something, but we're clearly coming, to something extremely strange. I think ancient archaic cycles are really buzzing, are really switched on. Right now in this country, in the UK, we've had all this stuff of leaving the European Union. And it's like our entire history is switched on. I started out as a history nerd, and my sense of the history of the whole of this country back to the flipping Stone Age is like it's buzzed up to the max. And yeah, at the same time, this idea of the abyss, what the hell is this COVID-19 scenario? I don't want to go into a load of shit about that because there's plenty of other people doing plenty. But there's no question that, in terms of there's never been anything quite like this in our lifetime, and what it's going to do to our world and us and how we all interact and so on. There's going to be a mutation, and we're being, the name of the game is keeping our centre of gravity amidst all this turbulence. And we are very fortunate that if we're not going to be able to physically go from A to B, we have got the internet, we have got Skype, we have got our mobile phones, we have got Facebook. We, even though an awful lot of nonsense and fear and panic is spread, we have the means to communicate, and we have the responsibility to kind of keep a centre of gravity and try and intuit the patterns and look at the theorists of the people that have gone before, whether it's Marshall McLuhan or whether it's Terence McKenna or what the hell it is, that we're entering into a new psychosphere now, and it's kind of terrifying, but it's also exciting. So it is, as you say, the themes that I was talking about over 10 years ago seem to be all the more vivid now, that there is some kind of weird abyss, and that we can give in to all of our the worst sides of our nature, and our fear and our negativity and our assumption that somebody else controls our life, and that the New World Order are pulling all the strings, and that they're going to control us and control our money and control what we can do. Or we can take heart from the consciousness revolution of the 60s, which has obviously got its roots going back ultimately forever through the hidden tradition, of the poets and the mystics and the esotericists that is transmitted through these magical orders and mystical orders and so forth. We can take heart from that. And make this, the question I'm asking myself, this is a kind of anti-Robbins power question. What's good about this? Is there a way that we can actually come out of this whole situation better than we went into it? How can we actually bring out the best in ourselves? It's kind of tailor-made, it is a massive, great initiatory process. So I'm going to be very, very interested to see what the hell it's all going to be looking like in 6 months' time. Because there's never been a likelihood of so much, so radical happening so quickly, where it's not an out-and-out war. It's something else altogether, and it's very, very interesting.
Without a doubt. Well, do you have any other concluding thoughts that you wanted to bring up, or any future projects or anything you wanted to announce?
Well, okay, I've just finished writing a book called History and Myth. Now that's based on the whole thing we've gone through in Britain recently with Brexit, and the fact that our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, seems to be resonating back with Henry VIII and stuff that happened the last time round, that we had the big astrological conjunction of, Pluto and Saturn in Capricorn. Now, the real theme, I guess, that's running all the way through it is it's very interesting, the different kind of ways in which history is written by historians in different periods of time. Yeah, I'm a big fan. There's a guy called Arnold Toynbee. He was a British historian halfway through the last century. He was actually one of the most famous intellectuals in the whole world. You know, he was a guy that had his picture on the front of Time magazine, worked for the British government during the First and Second World Wars, was considered to be, you know, a sound guy. And he had written a history of the world that was 7,000 pages long and took in 26 different civilizations. Now, the thing about Toynbee was that he was a real mystic and he had time slip experiences. And in the middle of this, you know, 10th volume of this enormous great history of the world, he would talk about how, you know, he'd been out in Greece with his head stuffed full of knowledge of what had happened way back when, and he would suddenly see some battle playing out. You know, he'd go to all these different places, and in London one day, he just felt the whole of some enormous great tide of history just moving through his body, and he went into kind of mystical raptures. Now, these days, the tendency with history writers, it's postmodernism. You just endlessly disappear up your own backside, looking at the intricacies of texts, how they were written, what they were written for, finding all kinds of nuances in them. You know, that this is biased in favour of gender and culture and so forth. You deconstruct the shit out of it, and you do find out some useful stuff, but you end up missing the life that's there in history. Somebody like Toynbee, who was one of the most famous intellectuals in the world, the idea of a historian as a mystic and a magus, it just doesn't exist anymore. You know, and the way that people like Edward Gibbon wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I've gone into a whole different way of looking at history as I've gone back through these astrological cycles and when they've happened in the past. I've looked at Glastonbury and I've looked at weird Book of Revelations, millennial cults in Europe, and how they seem to have echoes in the modern Extinction Rebellion, and try to just get a sense of the way you assume history is written determines the way you actually experience the history that's being made all around you while it's actually happening. So, you know, play with your paradigms a bit. Be willing to look at perhaps how historians in previous cultures and previous epochs saw the world. You know, look at the kind of omens that Roman historians like Livy looked at. Look at the way the Romans conducted themselves. You know, what way was the lightning flashing? Was Jupiter happy or not? You know, did you put off all business that day because of what direction the lightning flashed in? I love that shit. You know, I love entertaining the idea of what does it feel like to be living in a world that has that kind of way of perceiving things. So that's it. You know, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I'll save going off at massive length about it for when I've actually got the book, and I will obviously be trying to promote the hell out of it everywhere. But that's what my brain's been full of for the last 3 months or so anyway.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. I listened to an interview you did with Gordon White on Rune Soup a couple of months ago where I think you got into some of these things.
Basically, yeah, the whole of this book has come out because I had such good feedback from that. I just galloped off with it, and that's where it's got to, and that's pretty much finished now.
Well, definitely, you know, for those of you out there who haven't heard the chat that he had with Gordon, I would recommend that one as well. And certainly I, for one, am excited to read his forthcoming book. And the one we've just been discussing throughout the length of this podcast, again, is Aleister Crowley in the Aeon of Horus. It is great. It's extremely entertaining. It's very well written. It's, like I said earlier, kind of very much in the mold of the Cosmic Trigger. It's a great read. And I also found it actually to be very helpful for the book I'm writing on Jeffrey Epstein. It was very handy for the sections on Clan Fraser, Lovat, and Loch Ness, and certainly they also have a very, very bizarre relationship to the whole thing with Epstein, which I will get into in that work. But anyway, thank you again, Paul, for coming on again, and hopefully we
thanks for having me, for that great endorsement. I'll just say, in the USA, it's available on Kindle. There's and elsewhere in the world, there's still a few paperback copies left in the UK.
Absolutely. And like I said, I mean, anybody interested in this chat should do everything they can to track down a copy of it, be a Kindle or a physical one if they're available. So thanks again, Paul. And next week we will be back with Frank this time around, and we're going to talk with Kathy Morgan. We're going to go into some mind control, some deep underground bases, and inevitably Hellier. So stay tuned, folks, and I will be back again. Anyway, signing off for now, and good night, good morning, good luck.